So we're standing now on the right flank of the Union line, the left flank of the Confederate line. Remember, McClellan has a three-pronged attack. Attack on the right, attack on the left, main attack in the center. So this opening attack, he knows, is going to be very costly. And it's important that it be carried out effectively. So he's given command of this important portion of the field to a trusted subordinate, General Joseph Hooker, who is already well known as a fighting general, a competent leader who is aggressive, and McClellan has placed him in charge of the action here with a purpose. Because he knows that he can't personally lead this, Hooker has to do it on his own. So he gives Hooker total control over how to carry out this attack. Hooker knows the goal is to get up on the ridge, break the Confederate line, and that will complete phase one of McClellan's overall battle plan for Antietam. He crosses Antietam Creek at the North Ridge along with his own First Corps, and he moves across the series of woodlots and farm fields that you see around us here. That gives Hooker the mistaken impression that all of this terrain is essentially the same kind of woodlot small area. And so he's going to decide from the beginning to limit the size and scope of his attack to fit the ground at which he's going to fight. So as Hooker rides around this ground and comes up with his plan, he knows the terrain that he's going to fight on in this limited area. And it's essentially inside of a box surrounded by with woods at either end. On the northern end of that field is the North Woods, and you can see the portions of that have been replanted here. The other side of this box is bounded by the East Woods, which is over to your right, to the south. Then across that is a big open field. Where we're standing here was fallow at the time of the battle. The Cornfield, we'll talk about in a few minutes, is beyond it. And the other side of that box is the West Woods that you see beyond that farmhouse. Now, from early fighting that occurred here, as Hooker's First Corps arrives on this ground, he knows that's where the Confederates are because there's fighting in the ground between the East and the West Woods late on the day. But as darkness falls, fighting stops, as is typical for Civil War armies. And so they settle into the evening. They go to sleep, the men get rest, and Hooker comes up with a plan. He's going to launch a two-pronged attack toward the Confederate line. He's not going to find the end of it. He's going to simply pick a position, and he's going to send all of his forces, those two forces that are going to lead the attack, toward that same point. As a point of reference, that is at the Dunker Church, the small white Dunker Church. He picks it because it's an easily identified sign on the battlefield. No matter how confusing the fog of war is, the federal forces attacking are going to be able to see that small white church and think, that's what I'm supposed to attack toward, and stay on track. So Hooker stated an objective. It's clear, it's concise. Everybody can understand this very simple objective. Then he's going to decide how to launch his attack. His First Corps has, of course, 3 divisions. He's going to send his first 2 divisions together at the same time. Doubleday's division is going to drive down the road past the Miller farm toward the Dunker Church, almost due south. At the same time, Ricketts' division is going to be driving diagonally across this field toward the church. The Confederates won't know what the objective is until, hopefully, from Hooker's perspective, it's too late. Then, once they've met that objective, then his reserve division under George Meade is going to come forward and can reinforce success, or if things go poorly, stave off defeat and disaster. So it's a 2-up, 1-back attack, a West Point school book solution for how to launch an attack. So this is where the opening of America's Bloodiest Day is going to occur. As the sun rises, the first rounds are fired by the Washington artillery up on Nicodemus Heights, a hill that actually marks the far left of the Confederate line, although Hooker doesn't know that. As they move into the field to launch the attack, the sun is just coming up, there's confusion, and almost at once Hooker's attack falls apart. As Doubleday's division's advance begins, immediately they encounter fire from the west woods, Confederates on their right flank, and they stop the lead brigade, being the Iron Brigade, under General John Gibbon, and they begin responding to that fire, as you might imagine. So that attack stalls almost at once. Meanwhile, the attack from Ricketts' division actually goes even more poorly. He's supposed to be launching 2 brigades up, the brigades of Abraham Duryea and George Hartsuff. George Hartsuff being his most experienced battlefield commander. He's expecting Hartsuff to be the leader of this action. But as Hartsuff is reconnoitering the ground, he's hit by a stray round, a sharpshooter, depending on whose story you believe, and Hartsuff is wounded and taken from the field. Hartsuff hasn't told anybody what the plan is. General Hartsuff is carried off, and Hartsuff's brigade will wait here. Meanwhile, at dawn, they're supposed to get underway. Abraham Duryea, leading the other brigade attacking, has no clue what the plan is other than that he's supposed to drive toward the church. And so without knowing he's supposed to do it in concert with Hartsuff, he begins. So now, what should have been a 2-division, 4-brigade attack essentially turns into a 1-brigade attack. Adding to that is that Jackson has placed a salient at the end of that field. The ridge that you saw, he's got troops sticking out at perpendicularly from his main line in the west woods. Now, Hooker discovers that early in the morning, and he alters his plan to adjust for that. Rather than having the 3rd Brigade in Ricketts' division go forward behind the 2 attacking brigades, he tells Christian's brigade to go around the east woods and attack Jackson's salient line in flank, hitting its exposed end. It's a good plan, and it would have worked if anyone other than William Christian was in command of that brigade. William Christian had fought in the Mexican War, should have been a model general or leader, but this is his first big command. And the men don't know it, but at 2nd Manassas, it was his misfortune to claim to have sunstroke. So now, as he rides onto this field, he, instead of marching into the fight, he has his brigade marching around, stopping to do the manual of arms. Everyone knows there's something wrong. All of a sudden, Confederate artillery finds their range, and as the first 2 shells begin bursting around Christian's men, the colonel says something to the effect of, "This is what I've always feared," and he leaves. He abandons his brigade in the midst of the fight. So now Hooker's attack defaults to a single Union brigade marching right into the jaws of Jackson's salient and the main line at the west woods, which are going to be allowed to converge their fire on that poor brigade. So we're standing now on the edge of the famous Cornfield. This is what was to Hooker nothing more than ground over which his troops would advance. It was not meant to be something that he would fight for, and yet his own plan and the way that it unfolded and his inability to adjust to that led to the Cornfield becoming a key battleground, an objective, an intermediate objective that Hooker never really knew he was fighting for. He wanted to be fighting for the Dunkard Church and the line where the Confederates were posted in the West Woods. He ended up fighting for this ground behind me. Remember that Duryea's brigade ended up launching a single attack through the Cornfield, and they met the Confederate salient, which is formed along this fence line behind me. That's where Jackson put his troops, in that ground between here and the modern road. Duryea's advance got no further than a few yards beyond that fence, was driven back. Then Hartsuff's brigade, now in organization with a new commander, comes up and it fights, and back and forth the fighting goes. The Cornfield changed hands 12 times during this battle. And ultimately, it's Union control of this intermediate ground that will allow Hooker to stage the attack that will hopefully get the Union main assault back on track, end the first phase of McClellan's battle plan. Unfortunately, the fighting for the Cornfield and this intermediate ground between the East Woods, the West Woods, and the North Woods off to your left took most of the morning, wasting almost half of the daylight hours that General McClellan had to launch his attack. Lee's part of this plan is actually going swimmingly. The Federals have been attacking, tremendous casualties here in and around the Cornfield. It's exactly what Lee had wanted. Let McClellan wear himself down so that when he finally launches his main attack, then the troops will have evened out in terms of numbers, and the Confederates will hold the high ground, giving them the advantage when Lee goes on the assault. But as the fighting is occurring here and the Cornfield is beginning to be taken by the Federals, it's all due to the fact that Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps comes onto the ground. Hooker had been fighting with his 1st Corps all morning. It is used up. Every brigade has been worn to pieces. It's combat ineffective. Anything other than maybe being a speed bump to Lee's attack. But it's now that the 12th Corps is going to come on. The night before, Hooker had asked McClellan for additional support and to be given Joseph Mansfield's 12th Corps. The problem with the 12th Corps was that it was a mix of veteran units that fought with McClellan on the peninsula and brand new regiments that were so large, many of the Confederates thought that they were entire brigades, but they'd never seen combat before. Add to that, Joseph King Federal Mansfield, their new commander, had been with the Corps only 2 days before this action. So there's a breakdown in command. Mansfield doesn't trust the men in his command. The men and the officers don't really know or trust Mansfield, who's been given this position largely because he's on the verge of retirement. And it's a recipe for a disaster. But even though Mansfield is mortally wounded while moving troops into position to launch the attack, Hooker has begun to adapt and make a change. Instead of sending Mansfield's corps over the same ground as 1st Corps attacked, banging its head against the same objective, Hooker changes it. He's going to put Williams' division in the center of the Cornfield, and they're going to hold the Confederates here. Meanwhile, Greene's division is going to swing around the other side of the East Woods, hit this line in flank, and now the two, working as a pincer, will squeeze the Confederates and push forward. Now, just as that's getting underway, General Hooker is wounded. He takes a round in the foot. He ignores the pain for a while, but eventually he swoons and falls from his horse, and Abe pulls off his boot, which you can see blood coming from, and literally pours the blood onto the ground. Hooker is taken from the field in a stretcher, and at that moment, the commander of this action, the only man on this field who General McClellan has shared his plan with, his three-pronged attack, is removed from the field. As he does so, onto the field rides the next commander, the commander of the 2nd Corps, and we're going to talk about their meeting and what happens next when the 2nd Corps arrives in our next stop.